Perfect. All right, and now I'll hand over to Ian, who's going to be facilitating our session today. Ian, over to you.
Many thanks, Bianca. Beautifully done, as always. And a few thank yous. First of all, a big thank you to Alma and Malcolm Chiverton for attending this morning. Very special thanks to all my friends and colleagues at Emerald for supporting me this morning as well. And a big welcome to everybody else as well. One of the challenges we've had with all of these, I think, Bianca and Jeff and myself, is what do we cut out? They're such big subjects and we've got an hour in which to hopefully get some interest and provide some useful information. So that's my intent today, is I'm going to hopefully give you some useful things to go away with. And so it's really been a question of trying to focus on things that people will be able to take away and apply practically. I've also tried to leave a little bit of space in there as well for questions, so I'm happy to take them as we go through. So Bianca, if you and I can both keep an eye on the chat box if anything comes up as we go through, happy to deal with that at the time, because there is time for that. But there will be time for questions at the end as well. My involvement with project management goes back decades. I know some of you are going to find that really hard to believe, but it does. And I remember somebody that I was working with once saying that good project managers are worth their weight in gold. And I've never forgotten that, because it's absolutely true. If you look around a lot of the projects that you hear about, when they get overrun, it can cost millions and can have a particularly damaging effect. But there are some things that can be done to minimize the chances of project failure. So we're going to talk today about what projects actually are, the constraints to kind of keep in mind. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of project estimation and planning, and then leading projects as well. And as Bianca indicated at the start, it's primarily more business focused, but I've tried to keep it fairly high level. So any of you involved with projects at a club or organizational level, I'm hoping we'll still get something valuable out of this. So let's talk first of all about what is a project, because sometimes these things get confused. And the Project Management Institute definition is that a project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product or service. That might sound very obvious, and you might think, why am I stating that? Well, because projects aren't meant to roll on and on and on. They have a start, they have an end, they have outcomes. And it's really, really important to know at the start about what is it we're actually trying to achieve. You may or may not be surprised the number of times, especially in the software space, where projects finish and the customer said, well, that wasn't exactly what I was expecting. And even if it finishes on time and within budget, if it's not what the customer expected, it's a failed project. So it is temporary, it does need a start, it does need an end, and it needs outcomes. And I'm going to talk about, just very briefly, what a successful project looks like. And very simply, a successful project by its definition is one that delivers on the expectations of its customers by the agreed date and within the allocated budget. Sounds so simple in practice, in theory, but a lot harder in practice. So when we think about projects, projects always have constraints. And there's really only 4 primary constraints associated with any project that you do. First off, performance expectations. How good do we want this to actually perform? Now, you might think that it always has to work perfectly, but sometimes it doesn't. It might be a prototype. It might be something that's just done to demonstrate possibility. It might be a feasibility analysis. So it doesn't necessarily have to always be the highest quality. However, more often than not, it is. You would expect if it's supposed to do a particular function, then it has to do that properly, not only work on Wednesday afternoons, for example. It needs to have a properly defined scope. That is a clear understanding between the customer and the supplier. What exactly is it that's going to be delivered? So if you think about construction projects, they are, if you look at the contracts associated with construction projects, they are extremely detailed, describing precisely what the individual components, the colors, the materials are that's going to be used in the build, because if anything's wrong, you're going to get unhappy customers. And just to endorse that point, Jeff has kindly taken a photo of his bench top there to show how colors and materials are important in construction projects. Thank you for that, Jeff. They obviously have a prescribed time frame as well. And it's interesting that many projects, particularly in the business space, I actually think tend to put too much focus on the time frame. In other words, the sentiment can sometimes be, we just got to deliver it by the agreed date, whether or not the product met spec, whether or not it was working properly. And one of the things I would say is that if you have any indication before the delivery date that it's not going to be met, far better to flag that with the customer and let them know about a potential issue with the time frame, and then agree a change elsewhere. It could be that some of the scope may change. It could be you just apply more people, or maybe there's a budgetary change. It's obviously important to deliver on time, but not at the expense of quality. So one of the things that project managers really need to realize is that they cannot be given all those things and just be told accept it. They cannot be told it's going to have to be perfect quality, it has to be done by this date, you have to deliver on this, and here's the schedule. Because if you think about it, only assuming the quality is fixed, only 2 of the remaining 3 can be fixed. You have to work out the third. So if you have to deliver a well-defined scope by a particular date, the project manager will need to work out how many people is that going to take, what's it going to cost. If the budget is fixed and so is the time frame, then that might affect the scope. So project managers actually have a unique responsibility in any project to make sure that they have control over at least one of those elements. You can't just impose and be told that you're going to fix all 3. That's why I use the triangle. If you think about the triangle representing the project, the area of that triangle is the scope, and then each of the sides represents the schedule, the budget, and the quality. And if you want to put more into the project, increase the scope, then the other, at least 2 of the other sides are going to have to increase their length. So with any project, there's always project constraints, and projects will always typically comprise multiple tasks. There will be dependencies between those tasks. They always involve people. They will have budgetary constraints of some kind, and it might just be on people's, but even if it's just people's time, it's worthwhile putting a value on that time. And obviously, as I said at the start, projects need to come to a conclusion. So if you're in charge of that project, then it's your job to make sure that you have sufficient time, budget, and resources at the start. And if you don't think you do, make sure you get whatever you need before you even begin. It might sound an obvious thing to say, but I often see many projects start without a proper understanding of those things. And the project then becomes a voyage of discovery as you go through the project, working out, oh, actually, we need this. Oh, I forgot about that project. Timeframes increase, so does the costs, and people get disappointed. So actually doing a lot up front is really, really important. So I'm going to just stop here briefly, and I'd like to ask you, and use the chat function for this, just for a minute or two, have a think about why projects fail. I'd like to come up with the 2 or 3 main reasons why you think projects actually fail, and put those into the chat box. Why do things not work out? What are the key reasons, do you think? Really good stuff. Okay, so we're seeing lack of planning, goals not set, lack of coherent leadership, no clarity on project roles, unrealistic expectations, inadequate budget. So there's a lot of kind of resource stuff, as Jesslyn and Natanya agree with Alma there on leadership as well. Poor communication, yeah, that's a very common one as well. Really good list. You guys have obviously been involved with some dodgy projects. There turn out to be quite a few reasons, but I'd suggest that, and all those ones are totally valid. Every single one of those that you've listed there, I can think of projects where those have been a massive influencer. But there's 3 that tend to stick out to me. One is a lot to do with lack of agreement on project outcomes. What is it we're actually trying to achieve? And then the associated resources to go out to to be applied to that to make it happen. Another big factor which hasn't been mentioned, but I find is very much a killer, is where the actual scope or the requirements change partway through. So if you've ever been involved in any business projects, what you may hear is this: the customer will say, can you just do this? And the project manager, well, that doesn't sound like a big deal. And you often hear, well, for reasons of goodwill, we've decided we'll do that for you at little or no charge. And that's where things start to unravel, because every project change, if you planned it properly, exactly, Bianca, scope creep, if you planned it properly, then it'll finish where it's supposed to. If it's going to now accommodate additional things, something has to change, more budget, or the date has to change, or the quality is going to slip. So that tends to be a fairly significant one, but probably the biggest one is that lack of estimation at the start, really understanding what does this project actually going to take to complete. And if you start off with the project being underestimated, you're on a loser to start with. You're going to immediately make it hard for yourself. And that was one of the most prevalent reasons for project failure I saw, certainly in the IT and software development space. So for that reason, I'm going to talk a little bit about project estimation and planning, and I'm going to share with you a couple of little golden nuggets that generally don't seem to be known, but make a massive difference to getting quality estimation in place. Benjamin Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And that is so true. And the other great thing about a plan is it's a stress reliever. I'm very proud to be associated with the Rotary Club of Embleton District and the big projects that we get involved with. And the reason I think they're so successful is they're really well planned and well executed. So planning is critical. If you start to plan things out, then at least the stress can reduce, because you can see the areas where you may have problems or run into trouble, and at least you can manage those. So what often happens is this. So I'm looking at the poor planning line. Very often people get into projects very easily. It's very easy to kick off a project without doing all the due diligence and the upfront work. But what tends to happen then is, as you go through the project and you better understand exactly what really is required, and you understand that perhaps certain parts are going to take longer than you originally thought, you get what's termed the hockey stick effect. And you can see the hockey stick effect there. And this is where projects overrun. As they start to overrun, typically corners are cut on quality. It costs more expenditure to actually bring it to a conclusion. So that area underneath that poor planning line can become quite large. But when you spend the time up front and do a good job of project estimation and planning, yeah, there's an increased effort up front, there's no doubt about that. But the rest of the project tends to run fairly smooth. And if you look at the area underneath that curve, it's considerably less. So less pain, less expense by actually taking the time to do it up front. So from personal experience, we in software and IT space, we used to spend quite a bit of time on estimation and planning, and actually going back and having a look at what did it actually take compared to the estimates. A really important thing to be able to do. And I found typically that good project estimates were much more a function of making sure we identified everything that needed to get done than necessarily being really, really accurate with an estimate. You'll get some swings and roundabouts effects with the estimates. Some you'll be a bit high on, some you'll be a bit low, but it tends to come out in the wash. But if you miss things, that's where you start to encounter the pain. And some of the things that need to be planned in might not be obvious. Dealing with a client at the moment who, when they do their estimates, they don't assume there's any rework needed. They assume what I call sunny day scenario planning. That never happens. It never happens. So you better plan for things to go wrong. You don't have to double the estimate. There's a technique I'm going to show you in a minute how you accommodate that. But you can't plan it on the assumption that everything's going to go right. So the kind of things that often get missed are rework. Sometimes documentation gets missed. Sometimes the need to train people gets missed. The need to spend time planning and upfront and managing that gets missed. Add all of those things up and all of a sudden you'll find that the cost of the project is significantly more than it was originally thought it was. When I used to go and work with companies, and I used to go into new organizations and I talk about doing project planning for new projects, the managers used to get what an American told me was sticker shock when I came up with these. And they said to me typically things like, it can't possibly cost that much. It never used to cost us that much in the past. But it actually did. When you went back and look at what it actually cost, that's what it cost. They'd estimated it to be considerably less, but it actually cost more. So getting an understanding of what you're really up against, all the things that you need to accommodate is really, really important. So here is my absolute gold. Remember, you heard it here first. When you come to estimate something, you sometimes find when people put plans together, they'll do the estimates for everything and then they'll go, well, we could be a bit out. We'll put a contingency, a fudge factor in here. The problem with that is you have no idea how big this fudge factor should be. And it's hard to defend. If customers see there's any kind of hint of contingency going in there, the first thing they typically say, you can cut that out. So how do you allow for the fact that things could go wrong and not plan on the best case scenario? We heard if you plan on the best case scenario, you're going to be disappointed. That never happens. If you do your estimates based on a worst case scenario, you're going to be commercially uncompetitive. So that doesn't make sense either. So the way you actually estimate the effort required with a particular task is through this cunning little formula. So you take an estimate and you say, what's the best case? If I was to do this particular task, what would be the best case effort required to do this thing? And then you also look at what would be the worst case and you estimate that as well. And then you say, well, if under normal circumstances, things went okay, not perfect, but okay, what would that be? So you actually come up with 3 separate answers. So imagine you were trying to do a task and let's say your best case estimate was 10 days. Your expected was 15. And let's say your worst case was 20. So you'd apply this formula and best case is 10, expected was 15, so 4 15s is 60, that's 70, worst case 20 is 90, divide that by 6, your planning estimate, it comes out to be 15 days. But if you made that worst case, instead of being 20, let's say, if you made it 50, then it would, you'd find that it would actually be a little bit higher, but you wouldn't have to be planning on 50 days. It would be whatever that would be, 90 plus 30, 120, 30. You'd be coming up with an estimate of 30 days as opposed to 50 or 25. So play with that afterwards, but that's an absolute golden way to come up with a realistic planning estimate. No contingency, but you factored in the best case and the worst case. This is what happens when you can do that. This is going back quite some time, an organisation I worked with, and what this is plotting is for all the projects that we had underway, how many of the projects were coming in on time and within budget. And initially it was quite volatile with the first few months before we used this technique. Some of them came at 50%, and the average was 32, then it went up to 55. But as we started to put in place that more disciplined estimation with using that formula, we gradually found we could get our percentage of projects on time getting up to around about 70%. So it definitely makes a big difference, and it's entirely justifiable and defendable as well. Okay, so when we're actually getting into the planning phase, having done the estimates, there's a few things that need to be thought about, and I thought I would just simply list those. As I said at the beginning, when it comes to estimation, it's key to identify all the tasks and activities that need to be executed, including some of those things that you might have to undertake if things go off the rails. If it's a big project, it's really important to agree and assign task activity owners. So one of the bits of feedback I got back earlier to my question about what goes wrong was a lack of engagement and commitment. Thank you, Chris, that was you. That's really, really key, because the project manager has a key role to fulfill, but the project will only succeed if everybody plays their part. So making sure that there's agreement and a commitment to achieving the particular task is really key. And again, I highlight a lot of the projects that we do in our own club. One of the things that's great to see is the ownership that everybody takes within the team to get their particular piece done. Project manager is typically responsible, or at least will have to work directly with project sponsors to make sure that the necessary resources are made available for those tasks as well. We need to go into all those projects with our eyes open about what it's really going to take, because you don't want those surprises partway through. Establishing key project deliverables is important. What I mean by that are the outcomes, of the outputs, and some of those may not be just at the end. As we go through projects, there are certain things that need to be achieved, and if we're going to check that it's actually tracking to plan, if it's actually on task, then we need to be measuring that as we go along. So it's good practice whenever you look at any particular project activity is to determine what are those measurable things that I can have a look at as we're going along to see if we're on track or not. Major project milestones are really, really key. I'm working with a company at the moment who has just acquired another company, very different in terms of their culture and approach. So one of the things we're doing with our integration project is as a major component of that is looking at the cultural integration, because there's no point trying to put in place systems and processes unless the people actually start to work collectively as a unit. So there are always going to be important milestones that lead you up to your final deliverables. Once you've understood what all those tasks and activities are, then understanding the dependencies between them is really important, because if project B depends on task B depends on task A, then we need to understand that if task A slips, then we obviously need to see the impact on task B. So from that, it's important to derive a simple plan. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways that can be done in a second, but it's really important to keep it simple. Any questions so far? Okay. So there's a couple of ways to plan. There's a whole heap of tools online for doing planning, but one of the things I would say is whatever you choose something visual that can easily be shared, that people can understand. So this is one that's used quite a lot. We use this with clients that perhaps don't have any project management background or tools or training. And this just simply takes Excel. And so we've listed there the light blue lines are the main activities or functions, and then the lines below those blue lines are the individual tasks themselves. You'll see every task has an owner. For this particular example, we didn't put the estimated hours in, but it's probably a good idea too. And then we have a status associated with each task, and we color code that as well to see whether it's on track or late or hasn't started. And then for each of those tasks, according to the timescale at the top, we've shaded out the particular cell that describes the duration of the task. So you can see that some tasks overlap and some tasks won't typically start until another one finishes, but you've got a complete visual representation there of all the tasks, all the activities, and what's going on in parallel. The problem with it is that there is no dependency built into the tool. So if one task slips, you have to visually inspect it to determine the impact on the subsequent tasks. But it's very easy to create, it's very easy to maintain and manage, and it's a great thing to share. You need everybody on the team understanding how we're doing. Does somebody else need particular support? Is this area slowing down, or do we need to speed it up? So it's a good visual way to show that. And it's just using simple Excel. My favorite, but it does cost, is the Microsoft project tool. The reason I love this is because it is visually appealing. You can see immediately links and dependencies between tasks, And if an individual task slips, then you can actually, it'll actually calculate for you the downstream impact and show the associated slippage on the dependent tasks as well. You can see the start dates, the finish dates. You can plot progress against the tasks, and it shows the dependencies and the resources, the people associated with individual tasks as well. It's a very easy tool to use. It's like a lot of the other Microsoft tools. You only need to use 20% of its capabilities to get 80% of the value out of them. It's about probably about $800 or $900, maybe a bit more now, if you're serious about doing project management, but for me, it's still the best one there is. And you may know of other tools as well. And Chris has just commented there, which is a really good point. Sharing this thing around the whole team demonstrates that who's responsible for what, and hopefully will increase people's accountability because their progress is going to be tracked on those individual tasks. So when it comes to planning, here's some broad guidelines that I've always found particularly useful. The first thing, and it will come as no surprise given what I said just a little bit earlier, is making sure that you've taken the time to get accurate, detailed estimates. Can't stress that enough. When I did that little nugget that showed you how to calculate the actual planning effort associated with the task, that was purely a planning effort. It wasn't the time frame. And so you might plan an effort at taking, let's say, 4 days. But if the person you assign it to only can work at 80% productivity because they've got other things to do, then the task itself needs to be planned at 5. So you're typically not going to be able to, and you shouldn't be planning in tasks assuming everybody is available 100%. There will nearly always be things that will crop up. Sickness, there might be leave, there might be other projects the person might get called on to, customer issues and so forth. So getting a sense of how much time people can apply to the individual task and then using that to calculate the overall duration based on the effort required is really, really important. Many companies I see just to assume that the people are going to be available 100%. It's never the case, never the case. So the kind of things we want to add in, staff absences and non-work days. In an overall year, there's typically 20 days annual leave, there's 10 days public holiday, and there's up to 10 days sick as well. So right off the bat, there's 40 days out of typically around about 260 working days in a year. So generally, if you're going to be looking at planning for an organisation, there's only about 220 work days that you can actually use. Again, going back to what I said earlier about sunny day scenarios, you have to assume things will go wrong. It's a natural consequence, and it's perfectly legitimate to build that into your plan and factoring into your budgetary as well. If you do that, your chance of experiencing the hockey stick effect, which is a painful one, is not great. I can think of quite a few projects when I was in that software development space where a few of us be working till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not fun. Mistakes get made and you end up having to fix things subsequently anyway. So keeping that pace right through the good planning, through the good estimation is really, really important. One of the other tricks I learned was to actually almost keep 2 sets of books. So you plan the actual project itself and make sure that the internal milestones are met. But the milestones you might publish externally to the customers might be a little bit afterwards. Not much, but just enough to allow a little bit of room for maneuver in case things go wrong. If they don't, you look like a hero because you come in a bit earlier. If they do go wrong, you've got a little bit up your sleeve there to address before you have to do the external delivery. So it's not hard to do that, but I found that saved our bacon a few times. And then the last thing is to determine what's known as a critical path. I'm not sure if anybody has heard the term critical path, but I'm going to show what a critical path looks like. Basically, the critical path is comprised of those tasks that if they slipped would cause the end date to slip. So not every task on the project if it slips, is going to cause the end date to slip, but some of them will be. Some of those critical ones will be absolutely vital to make sure you hit those dates. And that's one of the great things about Microsoft Project. It will calculate your critical path for you. And in this case, this is a Microsoft Project output. Those tasks shown in red are critical path tasks. So in other words, if any of those three slipped, the project end date would slip. The tasks in blue, if they slip, won't affect the project end date. So that's not so much of an issue. So if you are getting serious about project management, this is a really good little tool to understand what are those tasks that are really, really important to keep on track. If I have to make some sacrifices somewhere, if I have to put some additional people to help a particular task complete, which are the important ones? It's really good stuff. So let's talk finally about leading projects, because projects don't succeed without people. And that's why I go back to my comment right at the start. Good project managers are literally worth their weight in gold, because you've got to be a jack of all trades. You've got to be good at planning. You've got to be a good organizer. You've got to be a good estimator. You've got to be great with people. You've got to have good interpersonal skills. You've got to be able to manage and juggle a whole variety of separate activities. So here's some suggestions for things to think about when you're undertaking a project. It's always a good idea to hold a project kickoff meeting. I'm going to talk about each of these in a bit more detail in a minute, but just to get people aligned, just get everybody together and understand what is it we've actually got to achieve. Obviously, the key job is managing the project. That's managing that scope creep, those change issues, the natural things that occur. People leave the project, additional people come on, project issues. There's a raft of things that have to be done there. And then the third thing, which often gets overlooked, but is so valuable, is to hold what's called a post-project review, or in some places project post-mortem, depending on how bad the project is, I guess. This is seldom done, but it is valuable because you really understand what was it that worked for that particular project, what was it that didn't, and you can learn from that to improve the way you do things earlier. That's why when I showed you that chart earlier, we held those things to better improve our ability to estimate the projects and manage them, which is how we got better and better. So it's often not done, but it's well worth doing. Even for Rotary projects, getting people together is a great opportunity to recognize the people involved. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Project kickoff meetings fulfill a number of functions, but the primary purpose is to get everybody aligned on what is this project actually about? What are we trying to achieve? How big is it? What are the key deliverables that we're actually going to be producing? What is the schedule? What are the key issues surrounding that? Where are our areas of concern? What's the budget that's been allocated? Who's going to own what tasks? And a really, really important one, and I considered putting this into the session, but I've left it out, is risks and issues. Best projects really do, the best projects are the ones where not only is the estimation good, but the risks and issues have been considered and thought about up front. And this is really, really important thing to do. Great project managers spend a lot of time on prevention and planning. And they look like great project managers because they have practically nothing to do for the rest of the project. They've taken care of everything up front. You sometimes see the Red Adair project managers have to come in and rescue it. That's not a great place to be, but that's typically because those things haven't been done up front. So just simply the way you look at a risk is you use this meeting to brainstorm what are the possible things that could go wrong. And you don't need to do this for hours on end, but you'll find that an 80-20 approach will really work well here. Spend 20% of the time, you'll get 80% of the risks. And then you look at each risk in turn and assess what's its impact if it happens and how likely is it to occur. And you can assign numbers to each of those particular factors, multiply them together, and that'll give you a quantitative assessment of the severity or the impact of that individual risk. And obviously the higher the number, the higher the severity, the greater the impact. So well worth addressing that. It's a great opportunity to also clarify any assumptions or dependencies, not just within the team, but perhaps with the customer or any third-party suppliers. And And that risk identification I talked about earlier, it's always good to get everybody involved from the team, because they'll be coming at it from different angles, and everybody will see and perceive different risks in a particular project depending upon their particular expertise. And apart from that, it's a great way to start building the team right up front. When managing projects, a couple of people, actually probably a few people right at the start, when I asked about why projects fail, they said lack of communication. Spot on. This is what addresses that issue, lack of communication. There need to be regular meetings, and typically weekly is the best. That gives people a chance to get things done, but it also means that things don't go out too far before, if there's an issue, before they need to be fixed up. And I typically found that there was a really good format to use for this. So every meeting we would start with actions. And the reason we started with actions is to make sure nothing got dropped. So whatever we came up with last time, we're not going to just overlook that and pretend it got done. We're going to find out, did it or did it not happen? So we always started the meeting with actions. And then to get it off on a good note, let's talk about what have we achieved over the past week, and opportunity to recognize people who've done a great job and let everybody know what's happening. Then we can review the risks and the issues. That initial activity usually creates something called a risk register. It's an idea of the project manager to manage that risk register and review it every week. So either they get mitigated or at least we've got the plan on hand should they occur. And then a look ahead. What are we going to do over the next week? Are there any issues or risks associated with that? Pretty simple agenda, but that seemed to be very powerful and a valuable little skeletal structure to manage risks effectively. Always important, and I'm a massive fan of metrics. So if you ask people how they're going, they'll typically go, yeah, fine. When I worked at Boeing, there was a very senior manager who'd walk around the factory floor and he'd say to people, particularly managers, how's it going? And they'd say, fine. And then he'd say, how do you know? And so it put a bit of a different spin. I think people are a bit reluctant then to approach him for him to ask how it's going. But the point is, if you're in a project, it's important to know how you're tracking, and keeping the data associated with this is really, really important. And I recommend wherever possible, keep it graphical, keep it visual, because people can immediately see. So, for example, here's one that it's a simple little chart. That red line is an indication of the project budget. So the project budget over those months is going to be taking us out to eventually project expenditure $2.5 million, big project. And obviously at this point in time, they're in October 20, that blue line shows how we're tracking with respect to our budget. And that green line is our forecast. So things are looking really healthy. We reckon we should come well under budget with this project. So just at visual look, you can see immediately how things are going, and everybody can understand that. And it's easy to create and easy to track against. Okay, and so as I said right at the start there, holding a post-project review is really, really important. It completes it for the team. It provides that level of closure. And the primary purpose of those meetings is to understand what worked, what didn't, and what could we do better in the future. And we can learn from it. There are always going to be things you can learn for it. I said right at the start, there are 4 key things associated with a project: the scope, the budget, the timeframe, performance. When you close the loop, what we want is metrics that show us how did we actually go against that? Did we deliver everything that was required? It's pretty easy to answer that. And we usually used to get customers' feedback on this as well when we held that meeting. The budget, if we're tracking it like I just showed you, is pretty easy to see. We'll know actually in every week preceding that whether we're on budget or not. So by the time you get to the end of the project, you'll know. Time frame, did we deliver against the agreed time frame or not? Yes or no, it's pretty binary. And how many issues have come out of that particular project? And that's typically how you'd gauge the performance, the quality. How many issues have we heard about from the customer? We would actually often do these post-project reviews, not immediately after the project was delivered, but usually a month or so after the customer had it, so we could get feedback from the customer whether they'd seen any issues or not. But it's a great way to close it for the team. We used to bring in pizzas, have a chat, and get everybody relaxed so they could talk openly about what worked. Really important in those meetings that you don't point the finger of blame. It's all about process failures, not people failures. So we get real learnings coming out of it. So I've deliberately allowed about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, but before we get to those, I'm going to ask Bianca if she could issue our evaluation just to see what you got out of today's session. So there we are, it's on screen. If you'd like to fill that in, that would be much appreciated, thank you. And there's actually more than 2 questions, you have to scroll down. Sorry. Wow.
Ian, while people are filling that out, I'm just curious around tracking budget. Obviously, you're tracking the cost and putting that against the, the predicted revenue of the project. How do you accurately track all the costs available? Because I'm guessing it's the time cost for each person on the project and any materials used. But do you have the organisation's overheads included in that, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One actually I've been dealing with just over this past week with an organisation. So you can track time, and then you could, at the end of that, as you track that time, you could convert that time to a headcount cost. So most companies will actually calculate a cost of a headcount, and the way that's done is there's a number of ways you can do it, but a simple way is to look at what the individual's total remuneration is. You apply a factor to that and you add in a proportion of the total fixed cost for the business. And what I mean by fixed costs are things like the heating, the lighting, the rent, the admin costs. You add all of those up, and let's say that comes to $200,000. If there's 20 staff in there, then you proportion $10,000 a year as an overhead cost to each person. And then you can add on top of that apportion their own salaries and so forth, and derive a loaded headcount cost for that. There's quite a bit behind it, Bianca. And it's a really good question, but that's typically how we did it. And once you set it up, the hardest part is setting it up, but once it's done, it's easy, because then you just can convert time into money and track it that way. And typically you're tracking against the internal cost, not the expected revenue. Great question, thank you. So I'm happy to take any other further questions. And then Bianca, when you've got all the results, then if you'd like to feed that back, that would be great. Any other questions? I'm happy to take those.
Ian?
Yes, Vicky.
Yeah, I have a question. You might have explained this before, but when you did the planning estimate and you had that formula, like B, C, what does the asterisk stand for with the 4?
Oh, times. Sorry, that should have been 4 times.
Oh, okay.
So it's best case plus worst case plus 4 times your expected. So it's a weighted estimate. Thank you, Vicky. I didn't explain that well enough. That's a good point.
No, that's fine. And you divided it by 6.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
That's why it's weighted. So 4 times your expected, because that's what you think it's going to be.
Right.
Add 1, so it's 4 parts expected, 1 part best case, 1 part worst case. That's 6 parts. Okay. So you then divide it by 6 to get that weighted estimate.
Oh, thank you. That's very clear now.
Yeah.
Ian, can I make another comment about that formula? And it's a little bit pedantic, but people who understand BODMAS will get it right. But others, it might be better to either put the multiplication in brackets or put the 2 additions on the end.
Yes, fair point there, Alma. You're right. Yeah, I should have.
You could come up with several different answers going through the formula. Yeah.
Good old BODMAS, aren't we? Very pleased we had it drummed into us.
That's right. Yes, I still have the scars.
Do the brackets first. Is that what you're talking about?
Or you could put brackets around the 4 times expected, so that would work. That's probably the best way to explain it.
Yeah.
So it's actually a weighted estimate. That's how it works. So if your worst case was a factor of 10 higher than you expected, you wouldn't want to estimate on that basis, but it will make a small provision for it. It will actually help you budget better.
And one of the points I was going to make, and I dropped you a private chat, is about people joining project teams. And, my experience is that there were people who joined some of the teams because they saw it as a career advancement move, but they weren't 100% committed.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. And, that's where the project manager, again, one of the skills they need is that ability to engage and inspire. Yeah. Sometimes you just don't have a choice. If you're in a work environment, you get told you're on this project and that's it. But as far as you can, it's good to get people really engaged. And that might mean spending a bit of time up front, just explaining the value of the project, how and why it's important. So people you really want people to want to join it as opposed to being told they've got to.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
Ian, how do you measure performance? Are you sending out a satisfaction survey to clients after the project's done?
That's another good question. So when I talked about performance, I'm primarily thinking of quality. And so a client satisfaction survey or questionnaire, it is useful, and certainly we used to do that for larger projects, but we tended to use more the number of issues that came back and the severity of them. Yeah. And in software, you can actually do a relationship, lines of code developed, and number of issues created. There are actually statistics and metrics for those kinds of things. But obviously the intent is you don't want much, if anything, coming back in terms of negativity, which tend to say that we probably met the spec. If you're getting a lot back, and that's often what happens when you have the hockey stick approach, it says that, there's needed to be improvement.
This is more just a comment. I just wondering we could kind of adapt some of this stuff to event planning for Rotary. Things like having a simple project management Excel sheet. And looking at expectations as well of events. I mean, I've worked with clients with online fundraising, and they often might say, "Oh, we want to raise $100,000," and you think, well, okay, how much are you going to get from each individual? So how many people are you then going to need to reach that target? And when they look at the numbers, they think, oh, no, that's not reasonable. So it's actually then working backwards a little bit to get the expectations right in the first place. So you plan to succeed, not plan to fail. So maybe some of this we could put something together for event planning for Rotary, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah, it's a good point, Chris. I'm happy to do that. Yeah, one of the issues I had with this was trying to find the pitch. And as Bianca said at the start, it was primarily at the professional. But if we're going to do it for more Rotary, then there's some things I would take out and there's other things I'd add in.
Simplify it and just have a sample Excel spreadsheet or something.
Yeah.
So Ian, there's a process that you'd be aware of called scenario writing, where you actually start at the end and work backwards. And for some projects, I've found that to be really more helpful than trying to find a starting point.
Yeah, as Stephen Covey, start with the end in mind, exactly. And that's where the project kickoff is so valuable, because when you first go into it, everybody's perception about what the project's supposed to accomplish can be quite different. And getting everybody aligned around that and then working back from that is really, really important. Yeah. True. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for attending. Many thanks for your positive feedback and for your excellent questions as well. I hope it was valuable. If anything else occurs to you subsequent to this, more than happy to take questions, provide answers, whatever's needed. So I'm really glad it's been of value. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Ian. That was very
Thank you.
valuable.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.
The next session is in 2 weeks. And the topic will be financial